why so many reflections along the way upon playing Undiscovered. It's a pretty incidental game if you look at it from a commercial or hobby presence standpoint. And it certainly isn't one of my sort of run to stand out, check it out. You haven't seen this, you want to see this kind of games. It is, however, being very, very successful for us during play, which is a triumph of its own, right? I mean, there's very little else that you could choose as baseline for whether a game is good or not, than to say, we're playing it. We're playing it honestly, and we know what we've tweaked, when we've tweaked it, especially in terms of initial choices. And we're liking it. We're liking our experience with it. So there you are. I mean, if you want the one thing you ask about, whether this game is, quote, worth it or any other qualitative, judgmental, benchmarks you want, I can't think of a more important one. So again, what is with all these reflections? Reflection number one has to do with questions that have arisen. Now, one of the things that I mentioned at the Patreon about the Fantasy Heartbreakers in general is that I always seem to learn things when I play them. They raise questions either through some surprising design or through some, I guess it's also surprising, but some misdesign or some weird gap or leap that is necessary to play. But it's always educational. You always come away thinking more about role-playing than you did before, thinking about parts of role-playing as units or as variables that you haven't thought of before. And in this case, it's fun to see this occur for the other people in the group. And so I'm just basically here now to summarize some of our conversations. If I get anything wrong, as the other interested parties may perceive, I hope they speak up and correct me. Something I missed, something that I'm misrepresenting, whatever. Okay, so one issue, which is, I think, an important concept for everyone getting into role-playing to encounter, and I think everyone has, is it's a terrible word, and I typically don't use this word ever. But it's the word that comes to mind to somebody, and it's the word that's used widely across the hobby, which is balance. And Helma was looking at her character's immense impact on fictional circumstances, effectiveness, via the magic. The magic in Undiscovered doesn't require rolling to accomplish, which actually was a little bit ambiguous. It takes a little bit of excavation to realize. I think the authors just didn't think they need to say it, or it never occurred to them to say it that uniquely, as opposed to everything else, which is very much universal system in the game, that you don't roll for success. You just pay your designated type of points. I actually screwed an NPC in a previous session by forcing him to roll for a spell, in which he failed. And looking back, I'm like, oh, well, that just should have worked. Well, anyway, Ithasha, the one really magic-wielding character of the three, is just a powerhouse of elemental magic and shamanic effects. And I think this raised Helma to say, well, what about balance? What's going on here with that? And was rightly concerned about all the things you may be concerned about. Is she going to start being expected by the other players to to make leadership decisions? Is she, sort of through the vagaries, through the dynamics of being more powerful, is she going to have more impact on how the story goes? I mean, what's going on here? And should we fix it? Is what's going on. So I broke it down into my way of looking at it, which I think you'll find interesting if you haven't encountered this before. I can't remember articulating it too recently, so maybe you've never run into it. But I basically, as I like to do, shotgun blast the term out of existence and say this is a useless term. It's referring to too many things that hook together in ways that they may not actually have to be hooked together. So let's just blow away the term and look at what will really be happening. So I broke it into three things. One is what I just mentioned, which is fictional impact of the character, what you may consider effectiveness, the degree to which they succeed in what they do, the number of other quantitative features that they can reduce or increase in others, fictional terms like, does the wall fall? Can she vaporize, elements of the landscape? Can she make new beings appear? And what are their qualities? All the effectiveness things, how good are they at hitting and how much damage do they do, if you really want to get incredibly basic about it. So whatever variables you would care to look at, is this character disproportionately stronger? And not just in a niche way, because we can acknowledge that in many games, characters have niches, that this one is maximized for performance in a particular way, and that one's maximized in a different way. And then the question of this effectiveness becomes a little iffier because you're, how do you compare? And so you start, wondering who really is more or less effective, not at a given thing, but in a more generalized way. Okay, so that's one variable, is that effectiveness impact kind of thing, very much a fictional phenomenon. So that's that. Then you have this much more important, you see, I'm getting ahead of myself. There are three, like I said, we'll deal with importance in a minute. Another one, which is how much attention and, appearance does the character get? So how much do we look at that character? And to some extent, you have mechanics that determine aspects of this, like, how, initiative order and how many times they get to go and organized things. But a lot of the time, this has to do with things that aren't determined with any instrumentation. So it's just a matter of, for example, how much do we see this character, and that can be handled through other techniques such as framing devices of all kinds. And a lot of those are soft mechanics, particularly in Undiscovered. It's the kind of game where the organization of timing and surprise and stuff in terms of physical actions is extremely ordered and known. But the timing of anything else outside of those confrontational circumstances is just whatever. So every group comes up with their answer to that whatever of how they do it. So that's what I'm talking about. Does the group's answer to how much do we pay attention to where that character is and what they're doing, or do they just kind of sort of appear in the situation because the characters that we do pay attention to are there, and this character is just sort of assumes to be around? Or do we have a dedicated effort of saying, okay, where are you? What are you doing? Freedom of action in that context and stuff like that. So we started using the words back at the Forge Spotlight to talk about this. And as most of you know, the game Primetime Adventure actually has a mechanic called Spotlight to formalize its use. So I'm claiming that it's always a variable, whether it's formalized or not, just like all variables in role-playing. It's not a question of whether they're there. It's a question of how formalized are they. The third one concerns the character's impact on events. And you might say, well, wait a minute, if we know about effectiveness and if we know about Spotlight, then don't we know, that already? Not quite. That's a third variable where we look at the character's presence in the game and we think about it in terms of what the player says that they can do and what's the scope of what they can say that the character does, in a very soft way, non-mechanized way, much more of a sense of how much are we as players paying attention to what this person, the other player, says, And to what extent does this player character have a social presence, a set of priorities which get realized or brought into the mix of what's happening in some way that makes this character's presence in the fiction a different thing than some other character's presence. I mean, you could say, well, I could play this wizard versus that wizard, and this guy's going to blast him with an ice bolt, and this guy's going to blast him with a firebolt, but it really doesn't make much of a difference which of those characters is in play. Or if you have a weaker wizard as opposed to a stronger one, well, this one, with this magic rules will hit harder, and this one will hit weaker, but that's the only difference. So I'm talking about this other kind of difference, which you may think of as a consequential personal presence for that character. These things are independent of one another. Let's take those latter two. For example, there are people who tend to play with less spotlight out of preference. And they're not unhappy that other characters get more spotlight. In fact, they're fine with the amount that they get. They don't seek much. But these particular players, and the kind of player I'm thinking about, plays in such a way that their character has immense personal relevant impact on what is happening. Why are we here? What are we doing? What are we going to go for? When do disagreements among us arise? Things like that. So that's what I mean. There's these three different variables. My claim is that the first is the least important. That if you have a player who is happy with their particular blend of the personal character presence impacts, I guess you could call it storiness, if you don't mind the bad word being mentioned, and then the spotlight amount. Simplistically we could say, let's just even it all out, make sure everybody gets the same amount of spotlight, even though that's too simplistic for people's preferences. But for simplicity, let's just say, all right, spotlight isn't a problem, whatever it is. We're just going to say everybody's getting as much spotlight as they want, presumably equal if we're going to be simplistic about it. Settle those, and then you'll find that differences in power actually really aren't all that important. That a person playing a less powerful character may well enjoy being, if you will, the foil or the contrast to this overpowered character. Or that in the fact they know that they are having a story impact presence, that their character being there matters, is actually more important than saying, well, I got to do, as much damage to the giant as that guy can do to the giant. I think that a lot of people focus on that one, doing how much damage do I do, or its equivalent, thinking that it is the road or the ticket to the other, which is what they really want. And that isn't true. So anyway, the question was, in those latter two variables, do we see an undesired inequality, an undesired distribution of spotlight and impact upon what's going on in any sense of the character's priorities, in any sense of the character's, just simply fictional presence as opposed to some other character. And our conversation went, nicely, in case you're interested, in the sense that we think, or we hope anyway, that those two variables are very nicely managed or situated at this time, and therefore any difference in that first variable, I'm claiming, is of interest rather than being a potential problem. It's only a problem if it feeds into or results in or exacerbates problems in the others. So that is the one reflection, the whole balance or lack o' balance, the not talking about balance but about real things instead topic. The second topic concerns my issue that I raised in one of the first few comments in playing the game, which is that since the game has lots of very nested gears, mechanical gears, it's notable for not spraying out into a whole bunch of different realms of rules for different things, but in having sort of boxes within boxes. And it's part of the design aesthetic that's extremely clear, that they really want to have a system and everything in it is a subroutine of the system. Now, when we turn to some of the nuances of the spells and the fact of the miracles and their different designations, we also turn to the fact that we're using one of the supplements, which is just a hair less edited than the core book. And I'm not going to say it's slapdash by any means. It's also nicely done in exactly the same format as the core book, so that you can take what's in it and sort of just treat it as extra pages. So a lot of that's true, but it's a different topic in a lot of ways. It raises a lot of issues that the core book definitely does not. And so, kind of, you have to, for summoning an elemental, you have to go to the level of the miracle that you're doing. This is in the shamanic rules. And then you go to the elementals in the core book, and then you go to the subset which says summoned. Then you go and you see how powerful the miracle is you're using, and then that gives you the fractional multiplier that you use for the listed numbers for the elemental. And then you have to look and see, well, what does the elemental do? In the case of the earth elemental, it will manifest as the caster desires, either as a sandstorm of some kind, or was it an earthquake? Well, anyway, some manifestation of the earth as doing a thing, or as a little being, a walking, do around kind of thing, whose capacity to do things is described mainly in terms of fighting. Now, it refers to it wielding a weapon. So it's humanoid enough to use a human type weapon, and it is described as a dwarfish, very solid, moss haired, which in our case is lichen because it's desert, kind of a gnomish guy in the old sense of gnome, not cute dwarf gnome. Well, anyway, the deal with this little fellow is, well, what can he do? We've got how far away it can be, he, she, it, whatever, can be from the caster when summoned. We've got how much it can move around, its movement rate. And we've also got how long it's going to be around. We've also got this notion of, okay, well, what can the caster tell it to do? It says obey commands. Very wide open in that sense. Okay, so as you may recall, in the session, there is a bunch of, at least two recently hatched basilisks who are squirming about. And there's all these pools of beautiful, sterile, disturbingly pure water with this wonderful, fine, sterilized, perfectly, unsullied sands beneath the waters. And that's exactly what our characters are looking for, at least one of them. And the trouble is that, of course, there are basilisks, and the characters are all poisoned and gasping and, battered from coping with basilisks already, and inanimate corpses. And there's just no reason to go back there in the thick of that water and go get the sand you want. Well, they started looking across her magics and saying, what do we want to do? And the sort of strategic reading of the rules begins, which is fine. This is one of the interests of playing a role-playing game, is, in a somewhat legalistic sense, what is the framework of magical effects such that particular acts can be or can't be done or could be tried. And so this can be a tricky thing in terms of dialogue, because if you understand that the dialogue is learning and table talk, rather than I do this, I do that, what happens, And if you understand that it has to be very, very provisional, this whole dialogue, we're all just spitballing and seeing, even to the extent of saying, well, when I read this, this is what I see. This can be very tricky because of the referee role of the game master. I've often talked about how the person who plays non-player characters and or the person who opens and closes scenes and or the person who makes up backstory. And then here's an important one, and or the person who interprets the rules. Very legalistic sense there. Why do they have to all be the same person? That's something that I've talked about a lot. Well, in Undiscovered, they are the same person. And so, you sort of stop and say, all right, well, it's pretty explicit in this game. The adventure guide is that person for all those things. Okay, well, as I say, learning curve, we're talking, and I quickly realized that since the game casts me in that role, that I can't just table talk. If I table talk, it's about my reading of what I'm seeing. It's already in the voice of you can this and you can't that. And since they're talking about tactics of how to get those sands over to them through the use of her earth elementalish magic, for which she has any number of interesting effects, and the players' readings are starting to sort of spiral off of intuitive leaps, and they see a phrase and then they're kind of jumping around, and then that's quickly turning into I do this, I do that, and I'm going, whoa, let's just have this conversation be a little easier and more gentle. And then I happen upon the problem. My reading of that elemental is pretty generous. I see absolutely nothing in there prohibiting the idea that it can go fetch something that's in its range of, if the range of movement and the duration of the effect of its existence permit, and we're not talking about it going and writing a sonnet or something, we're talking about it going and picking up something which is in and of itself a mineral. So it's not even being told to go and mix a drink or to cope with some other element that's not in its element or whatever. The idea that it would go and, not being alive, be unaffected by the basilisk's venom and gaze. And for other reasons, not provoking the animate corpses, that it could quite easily go over and fill up, as much of the sacks they give it with that sand and, troop back and hand it to them. And I'm reading this spell, and it's everything in there is just complete. It's almost as though it was tailored for an act of that kind without explicitly saying so. And I'm trying to get these words out in this discussion. And here's what hamstrung me. How can that be phrased coming from the adventure guide as anything except direction for what to do? How do you reconcile an optimal tactic for the moment with the learning curve? When you are saying, by everything I'm looking at here, I do see an optimal tactic. And it could even be offered in the spirit of the friendliest spirit of, hey, look what you can do. And yet the confounding of those roles, one of those roles of being at the table at all, is the capacity to look around at the textual rules we got and say, what is that? What are the ways that can apply to this situation? And then the role of the adventure guide, is my role simply to sit back and say, what do you do? What do you do? Which is my preferred role. I don't really want to be rules nanny, but we're all learning this game together, and therefore are we equals in table talk about it? And that's an interesting point. So anyway, it all worked out. I did, in fact, raise my interpretation of this and let them know that that's in their range of options. That's what happened. But, the fact that I interpreted it that way, I presented it to the group, and then I'm the one who oversees the mechanical conduct of getting this done. That this is something that very much Helma's character in the fiction decided to do. There's a lot of boundaries I don't like to cross. I don't think I went over them. I checked with Helma and said, hold on a second, was this really your decision? Stuff like that, but really I was walking on those boundaries. I could feel them. I've seen them violated so many times in so many different ways and under so many different assumptions that I knew when I was standing on it. So that was actually something you learn, right? Through playing a game like this this is how you end up standing on those boundaries. And one failure of attention on your part, one social failure on your part, and you have just stomped on someone else's agency and play. So all to the good that we didn't experience it that way. But boy, the reality of it is certainly a reality.